You've been talking to yourself your entire life. Every single day, from the moment you wake up to the moment you fall asleep, there's a voice running inside your head. It narrates your mistakes. It rehearses conversations you haven't had yet. It replays arguments you lost 3 years ago. It whispers, at 2 in the morning when you can't sleep, that you're behind, that you've wasted time, that the people around you are doing better and you're the only one who can't seem to figure it out. And the strangest part? You've never once questioned whose voice that actually is. Carl Jung spent years listening to the way his patients spoke about themselves, the phrases they used, the tone, the bizarre cruelty they directed inward without even flinching. What struck him wasn't that people had inner voices. Everyone does. What struck him was that most people had never stopped to ask where that voice came from. They assumed it was them. They assumed the running commentary inside their skull was their own honest assessment of reality. And that assumption, Jung realized, was quietly destroying them. Because the voice in your head, the one you've been obeying like gospel for 20, 30, 40 years, probably doesn't belong to you. It belongs to everyone who shaped you before you were old enough to decide what to believe about yourself. And until you learn to recognize that voice for what it is, and replace it with something actually yours, you'll keep living a life dictated by someone else's script while believing every word is your own. Today I'm going to walk you through what Jung discovered about the inner voice, how it forms, why it's so hard to distinguish from your real thoughts, the specific ways it keeps you trapped in patterns you can't seem to break, and the precise shift in how you speak to yourself that Jung believed could fundamentally change the course of a human life. Because the transformation people chase through years of therapy, meditation, self-help books, and spiritual practice often comes down to something so simple it's almost insulting: changing the way you talk to yourself when no one else is listening. Here's something most people never consider. The voice inside your head developed its vocabulary, its tone, its entire way of evaluating you long before you had any say in the matter. Think about the first 5 or 6 years of your life. You were absorbing language like a sponge. Every phrase your parents used, every inflection in their voice when they were disappointed, every sigh that communicated you were too much or not enough, all of it got recorded, stored, filed away as the raw material your psyche would use to build an internal narrator. The daughter whose mother said, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" didn't just hear a comparison. She internalized a narrator who would spend the next 30 years whispering, before every important moment, that she wasn't the impressive one. The son whose father went silent whenever he showed emotion didn't just learn to hide his feelings. He built an inner voice that would punish him for having them, that would call vulnerability weakness with the same wordless contempt his father's silence carried. Jung understood that this inner voice, this constant evaluating presence, wasn't some neutral observer offering honest feedback. It was a construction, a composite character assembled from fragments of every authority figure, every critical teacher, every peer who made you feel small. And the cruelest trick of the whole arrangement was that because this voice lived inside your head, you experienced it as you, as your own thoughts, as truth. This is what made Jung's approach to the inner voice so different from what you'll find in most self-help material. He wasn't interested in affirmations. He wasn't going to tell you to stand in front of a mirror and repeat, "I am worthy," until you believed it, because he knew something that the positive thinking industry doesn't want to acknowledge. You can't paste new words on top of an old voice and expect anything to change. The old voice is too deeply rooted. It's been practicing its lines for decades. It knows exactly when to speak up, right before you take a risk, right after you make a mistake, right in the middle of the night when your defenses are down and you're too tired to argue back. Jung's insight went deeper. He recognized that the inner voice wasn't just words. It was a whole psychological structure, what he called a complex. A complex is an emotionally charged cluster of associations in the unconscious that operates like an autonomous personality. It has its own agenda, its own emotional logic, its own way of seeing you, and when it activates, it doesn't feel like a thought you're having. It feels like the truth about who you are arriving with absolute authority. You felt this. You know the difference between thinking, "I probably should have handled that differently," and the sudden, full-body conviction that you're fundamentally inadequate. The first is a thought. The second is a complex activating. And the complex speaks in a voice so familiar, so intimate, so woven into the fabric of your inner life that challenging it feels like challenging reality itself. This is why willpower alone doesn't work. This is why you can read 100 books about self-compassion and still flinch when you make a mistake. This is why you can intellectually understand that you deserve good things and still sabotage yourself the moment something good starts happening. The complex is operating below the level of conscious thought, and it's faster than you are. By the time you notice the critical voice, it's already delivered its verdict. You're already feeling the shame, the contraction, the familiar shrinking that happens when the old narrator takes the microphone. Jung spent his career mapping these complexes, understanding how they formed, and, this is the part that matters, discovering how to change your relationship with them. Because he found that you can't kill a complex. You can't silence the inner voice through force. The harder you try to suppress it, the more power it gains. Because suppression is just another form of the relationship you've always had with it. The relationship where it speaks and you obey, even when your obedience takes the form of desperate resistance. What actually works, what Jung discovered through years of both personal experience and observation of his patients, is something far more counterintuitive. You have to talk back, and the way you talk back changes everything. Let me be specific about what this looks like, because the abstract version of this idea is useless. The practical version is what transforms lives. Imagine you've just made a mistake at work, something visible, something other people noticed, and within seconds, before you've even had time to assess what happened, the voice kicks in. You know the one. You always do this. You're careless. Everyone saw. They're going to realize you don't actually know what you're doing. It was only a matter of time. This is the complex, running its script. And if you're like most people, you do one of two things. You either believe it completely, collapse into the shame, let it color the rest of your day, carry it home with you, replay it before bed. Or you try to argue with it rationally. That's not true. I'm competent. Everyone makes mistakes. And that rational argument feels hollow even as you make it, because the complex operates on emotional logic, and intellectual counter-arguments bounce off it like rain off a windshield. Jung proposed a third option, and it's the one that actually shifts the pattern. You address the voice directly. You acknowledge it as a separate entity within your psyche, because that's what it is, and you speak to it with the authority of someone who recognizes what's happening. The internal shift sounds something like this. I hear you. I know this voice. This is the part of me that learned, a long time ago, that mistakes meant danger, that being seen making an error was the worst thing that could happen. You've been trying to protect me by making sure I never relax, never let my guard down, never stop being hyper-vigilant about my performance. And I understand why you exist. But I don't need this kind of protection anymore. I'm an adult who can survive being imperfect in front of other people. So, I'm going to handle this differently than you want me to. Read that again. Notice what's happening in that internal monologue. There's no suppression. There's no denial. There's no pasting a positive affirmation over a wound. Instead, there's recognition. You're identifying the voice as something with its own history and its own logic. There's acknowledgement. You're validating that this voice developed for a reason, usually a survival reason rooted in childhood. And there's a conscious choice to respond from a different place, from the adult self rather than the wounded child self that the complex keeps reactivating. Jung would have called this engaging in active imagination with your own psyche. He believed, and decades of psychological practice have supported this, that the unconscious responds to direct address. When you speak to a complex as if it were a real entity, something remarkable happens. The complex loosens its grip. The emotional charge decreases. The voice doesn't disappear, but it loses its absolute authority. It becomes one voice among several rather than the only voice in the room. And over time, with practice, something even more significant occurs. A new voice starts to emerge. Your actual voice. the one that was buried underneath all the inherited criticism and absorbed judgment and internalized authority figures. The voice that knows what you actually think, what you actually feel, what you actually want, separate from what you were taught to think and feel and want. This voice tends to be quieter than the complex, less dramatic. It doesn't shout. It doesn't deal in absolutes. It doesn't say, you always, or you never, or everyone thinks. It speaks with a kind of groundedness that the complex lacks, because it's coming from the present moment rather than from a 30-year-old wound. And the first time you hear it clearly, really clearly, without the complex drowning it out, the experience is disorienting in the best possible way, like hearing your own name spoken by someone who actually knows you. Jung experienced this himself. During the period he later described in the Red Book, years of intense inner work that nearly cost him his sanity, he developed the practice of actively engaging with the figures and voices in his unconscious. He'd sit with them, question them, challenge them, let them speak and then respond from his conscious self. And what he found was that this practice didn't just help him understand his own psychology, it fundamentally changed who he was. The inner dialogue became a tool of transformation so powerful that he built much of his therapeutic approach around it. But here's what most people miss when they hear about this practice. The transformation doesn't come from having nicer thoughts. It comes from changing the relationship between you and the voice. As long as you're fused with the critical voice, as long as you believe it is you, you're powerless. You can't challenge your own perception of reality from inside that perception. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. The fusion is the trap. The moment you create even a sliver of separation, the moment you shift from "I'm worthless" to "there's a voice telling me I'm worthless and I recognize where it came from," you've changed the entire game. You've gone from being possessed by the complex to being in dialogue with it, and dialogue is where power lives. Jung used a word for this that sounds more technical than it needs to. He called it disidentification. All it means is that you stop assuming every thought in your head is yours. You start noticing patterns. You start recognizing that the critical voice has a style, a vocabulary, a set of favorite accusations that it cycles through regardless of the situation. You start seeing that it activates at predictable moments, when you're vulnerable, when you're about to take a risk, when something good happens and the voice rushes in to tell you that you don't deserve it or that it won't last. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it, and that's where real change begins. Let me take this deeper, because there's a layer here that most discussions of inner dialogue miss entirely. The voice you use when you talk to yourself doesn't just reflect how you feel about yourself. It shapes how you move through the world. It determines what you attempt and what you avoid. It decides, before you've even consciously evaluated a situation, whether you're someone who can handle it or someone who'll be overwhelmed by it. The inner voice is the lens through which you interpret every experience you have. And if that lens is distorted, if it was ground and shaped by people who were themselves wounded, frightened, or unable to love you the way you needed, then you've been seeing a distorted version of reality your entire life and calling it the truth. Think about what this means practically. Every opportunity you passed up because something inside you said, "You're not ready." Every relationship you sabotaged because the voice whispered, "They'll leave once they really know you." Every creative impulse you killed because the narrator, sounding eerily like a parent or a teacher or a bully from 6th grade, said, "Who do you think you are?" Those weren't rational assessments. They were a wounded child's survival strategy, running on autopilot, applied to adult situations where it was no longer relevant. Jung saw this playing out in patient after patient. Brilliant, capable people living small lives, not because they lacked talent or opportunity, but because the voice inside them had drawn a boundary around what they were allowed to want, to try, to become. And the boundary was always set by someone else, someone who'd drawn that same boundary around their own life first, and passed it down, like an inheritance nobody asked for. If you're starting to recognize this pattern in yourself, if you're hearing echoes of your own inner narrator in what I'm describing, then you already know this work matters. And if you want something concrete to work with, something that takes these ideas from theory into practice, we put together something called True Self-Discovery. It's 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's approach to inner work, designed for exactly this kind of excavation, learning to identify the voices that aren't yours and finding the one that is. The link is right below this video. But let's keep going, because there's a piece of this that changes how the whole thing lands. The question people always ask at this point is, what do I replace the voice with? If I stop listening to the inner critic, what do I listen to instead? And this is where most self-help advice goes wrong, because the usual answer is some version of, be kind to yourself, or practice self-compassion, which sounds lovely and means almost nothing to someone who's never experienced genuine internal kindness because they've never heard it modeled. Jung's answer was different, and it's the part that actually works. He didn't tell people to be nice to themselves. He told them to be honest with themselves. There's a crucial distinction here. The critical voice lies. It tells you you're worthless, which is a lie. It tells you nothing will ever work out, which is a lie. It tells you everyone sees through you, which is a lie. These statements feel true because they carry enormous emotional weight, but they're distortions, funhouse mirror versions of reality, stretched and warped by old pain. The replacement voice doesn't counter lies with flattery. It counters lies with accuracy. When the complex says, "You're a failure," the honest voice doesn't say, "You're amazing." It says something more like, "You're a person who tried something and it didn't work. That's specific. That's survivable. And what you do next matters more than what just happened." When the complex says, "Nobody actually cares about you," the honest voice responds, "That's an old feeling, and I know where it comes from. But there are people in my life right now who've shown up for me, and dismissing their care because my childhood taught me to expect abandonment isn't honesty. It's a reflex." See the difference? The honest voice doesn't deny difficulty. It doesn't inflate your self-image. It places you in reality, accurate, specific, present-tense reality, rather than in the distorted emotional reality the complex generates. And reality, it turns out, is almost always more survivable than the complex wants you to believe. The complex deals in catastrophe and absolutes. Reality deals in specifics and gradients. Learning to speak to yourself in specifics and gradients rather than catastrophes and absolutes is one of the most profound shifts a human being can make. Jung noticed something else about people who developed this honest inner voice. Their external lives started changing, often dramatically, without them doing anything that looked like traditional self-improvement. They didn't set new goals or build new habits or push themselves harder. What happened was subtler and more fundamental. They stopped getting in their own way. The energy that used to go into managing the critical voice, into recovering from its attacks, into the elaborate self-protection strategies they'd built to avoid triggering it, all of that energy became available for actual living. It's like running your whole life with the parking brake on. You can still move forward. You can even build up some speed, but everything takes more effort than it should, and you're burning through fuel at a rate that makes no sense given how far you've actually traveled. Learning to talk to yourself differently is releasing the brake. The engine is the same. The road is the same. You just stop fighting yourself, and suddenly everything that used to feel impossible starts feeling merely difficult, and everything that felt difficult starts feeling manageable. Jung watched patients go through this shift, and he described it as one of the most remarkable things he ever witnessed in his practice. People who'd been stuck for years, in dead relationships, in careers that drained them, in loops of self-sabotage they couldn't break, would develop this new internal relationship, and then, almost as a side effect, their external circumstances would begin to reorganize. They'd finally leave what needed to be left. They'd speak up where they'd always stayed silent. They'd pursue what they'd always wanted but had been too afraid to reach for. And the changes didn't feel forced or willed. They felt inevitable, like a natural consequence of no longer being at war with yourself. This is what makes the inner voice work so different from other approaches to personal change. Most approaches try to change your behavior directly. Do this, stop doing that, build this habit, break that pattern. And these approaches work for a while, until the critical voice catches up and pulls you back to baseline. Because you can't sustain new behavior when the voice inside you keeps insisting you're the kind of person who doesn't deserve it, can't maintain it, will inevitably screw it up. The behavior change is downstream, the voice is upstream. Change the voice, and the behavior follows on its own. There's one more dimension to this that Jung considered essential, and it's the piece that separates his understanding from everything that came after him. He believed that the true inner voice, the one that emerges when the complexes quiet down, isn't just a kinder version of the critic. It's a fundamentally different kind of intelligence. He called it the voice of the self, and he considered it the most trustworthy guide a person could access. The self, in Jung's framework, is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious together, integrated rather than at war. And the self communicates in a particular way. It speaks through intuition, through dreams, through those quiet moments when you just know something without being able to explain how you know it, through the gut feeling that tells you to leave before your mind has finished rationalizing why you should stay, through the inexplicable pull towards something your rational mind has already dismissed as impractical. The critical voice drowns all of this out. It's so loud, so constant, so insistent in its demands for your attention that the subtler communications from the self can't get through. It's like trying to hear someone whisper in a room where an alarm is blaring. The whisper is there, the information is available, but the noise makes it impossible to receive. When you learn to address the critical voice, to recognize it, acknowledge it, and consciously choose to stop letting it run the show, the noise level drops, and in the new quiet, you start hearing things you've never heard before. Your own preferences, your own desires, your own sense of what's right for you, separate from what everyone else insisted was right for you. Jung believed this was the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming genuinely, irreversibly yourself. And he believed it started with something as simple and as difficult as changing the way you talk to yourself in the privacy of your own mind. I want to be clear about what this practice looks like over time because I don't want to make it sound like a weekend project. This is slow work. The critical voice has had years, decades, of unchallenged dominance. It's fast, it's practiced, and it knows your weak spots with surgical precision. The first time you try to talk back to it, you'll probably feel ridiculous. The voice will mock the attempt. It'll tell you that this is just another self-help trick that won't work. It'll point out that you've tried to change before and it never stuck. And part of you will believe it, because that voice has been right about enough things in the past to maintain its credibility. This is normal. Jung would tell you to expect it. The complex doesn't relinquish control gracefully. It fights, it escalates, it pulls out its most devastating material, the memories you're most ashamed of, the failures you've never forgiven yourself for, the secret fears you've never spoken aloud. It does this because the complex operates on a survival logic that interprets any challenge to its authority as a threat to your safety. In its own distorted way, it believes it's protecting you. It's wrong, but it's sincere. And this is where the practice of honest internal dialogue becomes both most difficult and most powerful. Because the response to the complex's escalation isn't to match its intensity, it's to stay grounded, to keep speaking from the honest voice even when the complex is screaming, to say calmly and repeatedly, "I hear you, I know you're scared, but I'm handling this now." Over weeks, over months, the dynamic shifts. The complex doesn't disappear. Jung was clear that complexes are permanent features of the psyche, but it loses its monopoly on your inner life. The honest voice gets stronger, clearer, more confident, and eventually, something happens that Jung considered the hallmark of genuine psychological transformation. The critical voice becomes just one signal among many, rather than the controlling broadcast of your entire inner world. People who reach this point describe it in strikingly similar ways. They say they feel like they've been living in a house with one window, and suddenly all the walls are windows. The world looks the same, but they can see so much more of it, possibilities they couldn't perceive before, because the critical voice had already dismissed them, suddenly become visible, Choices they thought were closed to them turn out to have been open all along. The limitations they accepted as facts about themselves turn out to have been opinions, inherited opinions, and opinions can be revised. Jung saw this happen enough times to trust it as a pattern. He saw that the people who did this work, who committed to the slow, unglamorous practice of changing their inner dialogue, experienced changes in their external lives that looked, from the outside, like luck or coincidence or sudden transformation. But from the inside, the changes made perfect sense. They were the natural consequence of a person who'd finally stopped listening to a voice that was never theirs and started listening to the one that had been waiting, patiently, beneath all the noise. And that's what I want to leave you with. The voice you've been obeying, the one that tells you you're too much or not enough, too late or too far behind, too broken to be worth the effort of repair. That voice is an artifact. It's a recording made a long time ago by people who were dealing with their own wounds and limitations. It plays automatically because it's been playing for so long that the mechanism runs on its own. But a recording can be interrupted. A mechanism can be understood. And once you understand it, once you see the voice as something that was done to you rather than something that is you, you're free to respond to it instead of obeying it. The response doesn't need to be dramatic. It doesn't need to be a thundering declaration of self-worth. Jung would have found that kind of performance suspicious, actually. Just another mask, a spiritual persona layered over the same unresolved wound. The response can be quiet, private, almost ordinary. I know where that thought comes from. I know why it's here, and I'm choosing to respond differently. That's it. That sentence, spoken internally with genuine understanding of what you're doing and why, is more powerful than 1,000 affirmations. Because affirmations talk at the wound. This talks to the wound. And wounds that are spoken to honestly, Jung discovered, eventually stop running the show. Your life transforms when your inner dialogue transforms. The external shifts, the better relationships, the bolder choices, the sense of actually inhabiting your own existence instead of performing someone else's version of it, those come as consequences. The cause is internal. It always has been. And it begins with something you can do right now, today, in the next moment when that familiar voice starts its familiar script. Pause, recognize, and speak back, with honesty, with specificity, with the quiet authority of someone who has finally realized they don't have to keep taking orders from a voice that was never qualified to give them. Jung staked a significant portion of his life's work on the belief that this kind of inner transformation was available to anyone willing to do it. That you didn't need years of formal analysis, though that could help. That you didn't need special training or spiritual achievement or any particular credential. You needed willingness. Willingness to listen to yourself closely enough to distinguish the borrowed voices from the authentic one. Willingness to sit with the discomfort of challenging a narrator who's been unchallenged for as long as you can remember. Willingness to trust that underneath all the inherited criticism, there's someone real, someone who's been waiting, quietly, for you to stop listening to everyone else long enough to hear them. That someone is worth hearing. And the conversation you start with them, awkward, uncertain, maybe even a little absurd at first, is the most important conversation you'll ever have. Because every other conversation in your life, every relationship, every choice, every risk you take or refuse to take is shaped by this one. The one happening silently, constantly, in the space between your ears. Change this conversation, and you change the container that holds everything else. Jung knew this. His patients discovered it. And now the question is whether you're willing to discover it too, one honest, internal sentence at a time. If you've been feeling the pull to do this kind of inner work, to actually sit down with the voices inside you and start sorting out which ones are yours and which ones were planted there, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's approach to understanding the inner dialogue, designed to help you find the voice that's been buried under decades of borrowed ones. The link is right below this video.